All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're looking at a really interesting shift that's happening in international education.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, we're going to be focusing on how and why more and more African students are choosing to study in some pretty unexpected locations.
That's fascinating.
And our guide for this deep dive is going to be an article from the PIE News titled, African Students Break Away from Big Four.
Okay.
It was published pretty recently, just last month, on January 23rd, 2025.
I actually think I saw that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely caught my eye, because for so long it's been the US, UK, Canada, and Australia dominating as the top destinations for international students.
The Big Four, as
Yes.
they're called. But this article is saying that things might be changing.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is it that's drawing African students to these new destinations?
Well, it's not just one thing. It's a bunch of factors kind of all coming together at the same time. The article highlights how countries in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia are becoming increasingly popular.
Like where specifically?
We'll think Germany, France, Ireland, Turkey, Cyprus, Hungary, Georgia, Poland, Malta, Dubai, Malaysia, and India.
Wow, that's quite the list. So what's the common theme here? Is it all about trying to save money?
Affordability is a big factor for sure. The article says that tuition fees in a lot of these places can be as low as $5,000 per year.
Oh.
With living costs that are similar to what you'd find in the Big Four, but it can't just be about the money, right?
That's what I was thinking. If it was all about cost, then everyone would just flock to the absolute cheapest option.
Yeah.
So there's got to be something more to it.
Absolutely. The article also points to visa success rates as a major factor in students' decisions.
Right, because it's one thing to get accepted to a program, but if you can't even get a visa to go there, then what's the point?
Exactly. You've put in all that time, effort, and money to apply. The last thing you want to see is a visa rejection.
Ugh, so stressful.
Some agents are reporting 100% visa success rates in these emerging destinations, which is a stark contrast to the often frustrating and unpredictable process a lot of African students face when they're trying to get visas to study in the Big Four.
I can only imagine what a relief that must be for students and their families.
Definitely. It's peace of mind,
Totally. So it's about more than just cost then.
It is. Some of these emerging destinations also offer good career prospects and opportunities to work after you graduate.
Okay, so it's not just about saving money while you're studying. It's about potentially setting yourself up for a career in a new and exciting environment.
Right. And it's actually becoming super competitive.
What do you mean?
Well, the article talks about this study abroad conference in Nairobi where universities from both emerging destinations and the Big Four were all trying to recruit students and parents.
Oh, wow. I bet that was an interesting event. So who won?
You might be surprised to hear this.
Wow.
Cyprus and Turkey were the top choices for the people who attended,
Really?
beating out more traditional study destinations like the US and the UK.
Wow. That's a pretty clear indication that perceptions are shifting.
Right.
So what is it exactly that's pushing students away from the Big Four in the first place?
Well, the article mentions that changes to immigration policies in those countries is a big push factor.
Like what specifically?
Things like reduced post-study work rights, international student quotas, and tougher visa regulations.
I see.
It's just becoming harder and harder for international students, especially those from certain regions, to stay on and work after they finish their studies.
So on the one hand, it's really expensive to study in those countries, but then even if you do manage to go there, it's getting harder to actually build a career there afterwards.
Right. And then you also have to consider the economic situation in a lot of African countries where affordability is understandably a top concern for students and their families.
So it's like this perfect storm of push and pull factors.
Yeah. Pushing students away from the Big Four and drawing them towards these new and emerging destinations.
But I think the article did mention one interesting exception, right?
You're talking about Ireland.
Yeah. They seem to be doing something right by combining affordability with opportunities to work after you graduate.
Yeah, the article quotes someone named Farouk Lalji of Koala Education Consultants.
Yeah.
And he makes the point that because Ireland is a member of the EU, that's a big draw for students.
Oh, right, because then they can potentially work in other European countries after they graduate.
Exactly. It's like they've found this sweet spot that's attracting a lot of international talent.
That's really smart, offering a good education, attractive career pathways.
It'll be interesting to see if other countries start copying that model.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked about some of the big picture trends here.
Yeah.
But let's get into some specific examples of how these emerging destinations are actually attracting African students.
Okay.
What are some of the things that stood out to you in the article?
Well, Malaysia, for example, hosted over 3,600 African students in 2023.
Wow, that's a lot.
They're really trying to establish themselves as this regional hub for higher education. They've got a ton of programs, often with pretty competitive tuition fees, and that multicultural environment can be a big plus for a lot of students.
It seems like they're doing all the right things.
They are, but there's one little catch.
What's that?
African students can't actually access Malaysia's post-study graduate pass program at the moment.
Oh, what does that mean?
So it's this program that lets graduates from certain countries stay on and work for up to 12 months after they finish their studies.
Oh, so if you're an African student hoping to get some international work experience in Malaysia, that's a problem.
It is. So it's a good reminder that you really need to do your research and understand all the details of each country's policies.
It's not just about the flashy brochures and websites.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, there's Turkey. They've seen a huge increase in the number of African students studying there.
How big are we talking?
They went from having just 19,000 African students in 2019 to 61,000 in 2023.
Wow, that's huge. What's driving that kind of growth?
Well, it seems to be a combination of things. They have relatively affordable tuition compared to the Big Four. The visa process is pretty straightforward, and there are more and more programs being taught in English.
Makes sense.
Plus, you can't really ignore the appeal of Turkey's location and its cultural heritage,
Yeah, being at the crossroads of Europe and Asia has to be pretty appealing for students who are looking for a truly global experience.
Definitely. Then there's northern Cyprus, which has kind of become this popular route to Europe,
Oh, really?
especially for migrants, and that's reflected in the student population there.
In what way?
Well, in 2022, out of roughly 50,000 international students studying in northern Cyprus, almost 17,500 of them were from Nigeria.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That's a huge proportion.
Yeah, it's huge. And it shows just how much political factors and visa policies can really influence where students end up going to study.
Totally. And then I think the last example the article mentioned was Georgia.
Oh, yeah, it's Georgia.
They saw a huge surge in African students enrolling in 2023.
A lot of them were actually students who were transferring from Ukraine because of the conflict.
Oh, wow.
It really just highlights how these major global events can completely upend people's lives and force them to make tough choices.
It's incredible that those students were able to keep going with their education in the face of all that upheaval.
It's amazing. And for Georgia, this sudden influx of students presented both challenges and opportunities, right?
Yeah, I can imagine. Their resources and infrastructure were probably stretched pretty thin, but they also got this huge influx of talent and diversity.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder of how interconnected the world is and how events in one part of the globe can ripple out and affect people everywhere.
So I feel like we've covered a lot here.
We have.
It's clear that the landscape of international education is going through some pretty big changes.
It really is.
So where do we go from here? What does all this mean for the future of global education?
Well, that's the question we're going to tackle in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay, so stay tuned, everyone.
Yeah, we'll be back.
We've got a lot more to unpack.
We've got a lot more to unpack and explore the potential implications of this trend and what it could mean for the future of global education. So we've been unpacking this pretty fascinating shift in international education, haven't we?
We have, with African students increasingly looking beyond those traditional destinations.
The Big Four.
The Big Four, exactly.
It's time to think about what this all means for the future of global education as a whole.
Okay, so let's put on our futurology hats for a minute.
Right.
What kind of impact do you think this trend could have on both the students themselves and on the universities?
Well, one really interesting possibility is that we might see a more balanced distribution of international students around the world.
What do you mean?
Imagine a world where students have way more choices than they used to,
Okay.
where emerging destinations are competing with each other on quality and affordability. And the benefits of international education are kind of spread out more evenly across the globe.
That does sound pretty ideal. But is that really achievable? What would it take to actually create that kind of world?
Well, it would definitely require a big change in mindset.
Whose mindset?
Both students and ED institutions. Students would have to be more open to exploring these unconventional pathways, venturing beyond those big name brands and institutions.
Okay, so it's not just about students being more adventurous.
It's not just about the students.
It's also about the university stepping up their game and making themselves more attractive to a global audience.
Exactly. And we'd also need to see much greater cooperation between countries.
What would that look like?
Think streamlined visa processes, a mutual recognition of qualifications across different borders,
Oh, yeah.
and creating a more welcoming and inclusive environment for international students in general.
So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach,
Totally, yeah.
a more interconnected, more collaborative approach to international education.
Exactly. Now let's flip the script for a second
Okay.
and consider how the Big Four might react to this growing competition. Well, that's interesting.
What do you think they might do to stay relevant in this new landscape?
Well, I guess they can't just sit back and expect things to stay the same.
Right.
They're going to have to become a lot more strategic in how they recruit international students.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll start targeting students from specific regions or with specific skill sets that align with their national priorities.
Yeah, or their economic needs.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. We might also see them tailoring their programs and scholarships to be more attractive to specific groups of students,
Like niche marketing for higher education.
It's a bit like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like any other competitive market. Universities are going to have to adapt to what their consumers want.
Their consumers being international students in this case.
Exactly.
Do you think we might see even more partnerships between universities, governments, and industries?
Oh, absolutely.
Really? Yeah. I think these public-private partnerships are going to become even more important as governments and industries realize they need to work together to attract and keep international talent.
So more collaboration within countries as well as between them.
Yeah, I think so.
This is shaping up to be a pretty major shakeup of the entire system.
It is.
But, it's easy to get swept up in all the potential benefits.
Yeah.
We should probably consider some of the possible downsides, too. What if this competition actually ends up creating a more fragmented and unequal global education landscape?
That's a really good point, and it's something we need to think about carefully. If things don't go well, there's a chance that access to quality international education could become even more tied to things like where you're from, how much money you have, and even political alliances.
Oh, I see.
Instead of creating more opportunities for everyone, it could actually end up reinforcing existing inequalities.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. And it reminds us that globalization in and of itself isn't necessarily a force for greater equality or opportunity.
Yeah.
We have to be very intentional about making sure the benefits of international education are shared widely and equitably.
So how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we make sure the shift towards diversification actually leads to a more just and inclusive global education system for everyone?
That is the million-dollar question. And honestly, I don't think there's a single easy answer.
Okay.
But I do think that open dialogue, transparency, and a commitment to collaboration are all going to be absolutely essential
Between you.
between universities, governments, and international organizations.
Okay.
They need to work together to create a framework that prioritizes fairness, accessibility, and quality for all students, regardless of where they come from.
That makes sense.
Let's bring it back down to earth for a moment.
Right.
Think about our listeners who are maybe thinking about studying abroad.
Okay.
What does all this mean for them?
Yeah, what advice would you give them as they try to figure out their options in this increasingly complex world?
Yeah. Honestly, I would say the most important thing is to embrace the fact that they have so many more options now than ever before.
Yep.
Don't feel limited by the traditional pathways, the ones everyone's always told them they have to follow.
Yeah.
Do your research, explore different destinations, and really figure out what you want to get out of this experience.
What are some questions listeners should be asking themselves as they research their options?
Yeah, think about your long-term goals. What skills are you hoping to develop? Where do you see yourself working in the future? What kind of cultural experience are you looking for?
Okay.
And then, of course, there are the practical things to consider, like how much it will cost, what the visa regulations are like, and whether there are any opportunities to work after you graduate.
So it's almost like creating your own personalized education roadmap.
Yeah, exactly. And don't be afraid to think outside the box.
Right.
Maybe a dual degree program or a joint program with universities in different countries or even some online learning options could give you some really unique advantages and flexibility.
Yeah, that's true. A lot more options now.
Definitely. And remember, this whole experience is about so much more than just academics.
What else is there?
It's about personal growth, expanding your horizons, and building a global network.
So don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone and really embrace new experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. Now, as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I want to focus on some specific examples of how this shift is playing out in the real world.
Okay.
Let's take a closer look at what some of these emerging destinations have to offer African students, starting with Malaysia.
All right, let's go.
Malaysia has really been growing in popularity with African students, and I think there are a few key reasons for that.
Okay, what are they?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, they've got a really diverse range of programs, and the costs are often very competitive.
Okay.
They're also working hard to create a multicultural environment that feels welcoming to students from all over the world.
Sounds pretty appealing.
It does, but there's that one little catch we talked about earlier.
Oh yeah, the post-study work opportunities.
Yeah, specifically the Graduate Pass program, which African students currently don't have access to.
Right, that's definitely something to consider if you're hoping to gain some international work experience after you graduate.
Absolutely. Now let's switch gears and talk about Turkey.
Okay.
Their African student population has been growing incredibly fast in recent years. They hit 61,000 students in 2023.
I know. We were talking about that earlier. It's like 3 times what it was just a few years ago.
Exactly.
So what's the secret to their success?
It seems like they've just got a really good package for African students.
Like what?
They have more affordable tuition than a lot of those traditional destinations. The visa process is relatively easy, and there are more and more programs being offered in English every year.
Okay.
Plus, you can't underestimate the appeal of Turkey's location and its cultural heritage, right?
Yeah, that was one of the things we talked about earlier. Being at the crossroads of Europe and Asia has to be pretty interesting for students who are looking for a truly global experience.
Right. Plus, it looks like they're really actively trying to attract international students.
How so?
They're offering scholarships, streamlining visa processes, and investing in infrastructure to improve the overall student experience.
That's smart.
Yeah, and it seems to be working. Now, let's talk about Northern Cyprus.
Yeah.
It's become a really popular gateway to Europe, particularly for migrants, and we can really see that reflected in their student body.
Oh, right. We mentioned that earlier. A really big chunk of their international students are actually Nigerian.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it shows just how important political factors and visa policies can be in shaping international education trends.
For some students, Northern Cyprus might be the only realistic way to get to Europe.
Yeah, that's true. And finally, let's talk about Georgia, which saw a huge influx of African students in 2023, many of whom were transferring from Ukraine because of the war.
I remember reading about that. It's amazing how resilient those students have been in the face of so much upheaval.
It really is inspiring. And for Georgia, this sudden wave of students presented a whole mix of challenges and opportunities, right?
I can imagine they suddenly had to accommodate a lot more students than they were probably used to.
It probably stretched their resources and infrastructure, but it also brought a wave of new talent and diversity to their campuses.
Yeah, it's a great example of how global events can completely reshape the international education landscape in totally unexpected ways.
So as you can see, there's a lot of complexity and nuance to all of this.
There is.
There's no single best destination for everyone.
It really depends on your individual goals and needs.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's think about what this means for the future. What might the next chapter hold for international education as this trend of diversification continues to play out?
So we've spent this deep dive exploring this really interesting shift that's happening in international education,
Yeah.
where African students are increasingly looking at destinations beyond those traditional Big Four countries.
It's definitely a trend worth watching.
So as we wrap things up here, let's talk about the future.
Okay.
What could the next chapter hold for international education?
You know, it's kind of like we're peering into a crystal ball, isn't it?
Yeah,
We can't predict the future with 100% certainty,
of course not.
but we can try to imagine some of the different ways things might unfold.
Exactly. So let's do that.
Right.
Let's put on our futurist hats for a minute and think about some possible scenarios.
Okay, I like it.
What could happen as this trend of diversification continues to gain momentum?
Well, one possibility that I find really intriguing is that we could see a much more balanced distribution of international students around the world.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Imagine a world where students have a much wider range of options to choose from,
Okay.
where those emerging destinations are competing with each other on things like quality and affordability, and where the benefits of international education are spread out more evenly across different countries and regions.
It sounds pretty utopian, doesn't it?
It does.
Everyone wins.
But the question is, what would it actually take to make that happen?
Yeah. How do we get from here to there?
Honestly, I think it would require a pretty significant shift in mindset, both from students and from institutions.
What do you mean?
On the student side, I think there needs to be more openness to exploring those less traditional pathways.
So not being afraid to venture outside of those big name brands.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about the institutions?
Well, universities and colleges would need to really step up their game in terms of attracting a more diverse range of students.
So it's a two-way street.
It is.
Students need to be more adventurous,
Yeah,
and universities need to be more proactive in marketing themselves to a global audience.
exactly. But beyond that, I think we'd also need to see a much higher level of cooperation between countries.
In what sense?
Well, think about things like streamlined visa processes so it's easier for students to move between countries,
Okay.
or mutual recognition of qualifications across borders.
Oh, so your degree from one country is automatically recognized in another.
Right. And of course, just generally creating a more welcoming and inclusive environment for international students.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It would take a real team effort to make this kind of vision a reality.
So more interconnection, more collaboration.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's try looking at it from a different angle.
What do you have in mind?
How do you think those big four countries might respond to this growing competition?
I mean, they can't just ignore it, can they?
Probably not.
They're going to have to get a lot more strategic about how they recruit international students.
In what way?
I think we'll see them start to target students from specific regions or with particular skills that are in high demand in their countries.
So aligning their recruitment efforts with national priorities and economic needs.
Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if they start tailoring their programs and scholarships to appeal to very specific groups of students.
So more niche marketing.
Kind of like that, yeah.
It's almost like any other industry. If you want to stay competitive, you have to understand your customers and give them what they want.
Right. In this case, the customers are international students.
Exactly. What about partnerships? Do you think we'll see more of those between universities, governments, and industries?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Why do you think so?
Well, it just makes sense. Governments and industries are increasingly recognizing the importance of attracting global talent. And universities are well positioned to help them do that.
So those kinds of partnerships can benefit everyone.
Right. The university gets more resources and connections.
Okay.
The government and industries get access to a pool of highly skilled workers.
It seems like this trend could really lead to a much more interconnected and collaborative approach to international education.
I think so, too. But, it's important to be realistic.
Okay, what do you mean?
We've talked a lot about the potential benefits of this shift towards diversification.
We have.
But there are also some potential downsides that we need to be aware of.
What are you thinking?
Well, what if this competition between countries for international students gets so intense that it actually ends up creating a more fragmented and unequal global education landscape?
That's an interesting point. How could that happen?
Well, one way is if access to quality international education becomes even more dependent on things like your nationality, how much money you have, or which countries your home country has good relationships with.
So instead of creating more opportunities for everyone, it could actually make things less fair.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. And it just reminds us that globalization doesn't automatically lead to more equality.
Right.
It takes conscious effort and careful planning to make sure the benefits of something like international education are shared widely and fairly.
So how do we make sure that happens? How do we ensure that this shift towards diversification actually leads to a more just and inclusive global education system for everyone?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Honestly, I don't think there's any easy answer, but I do think that open and honest communication is essential
Between who?
between universities, governments, and international organizations.
Okay.
We need more transparency, more collaboration, and a real commitment to working together to create a system that prioritizes fairness, accessibility, and quality for all students, regardless of where they're from.
That sounds like a tall order, but it's definitely a worthwhile goal.
I agree.
Okay, so let's bring this back down to earth for a moment.
All right.
If you're listening to this and thinking about studying abroad, what does all of this mean for you?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that you have more options than ever before.
That's exciting.
It is. Don't limit yourself to the traditional pathways. Don't feel like you have to do what everyone else is doing.
So don't just follow the crowd?
Exactly.
Oh,
Do
wait.
your research, explore different countries and programs, and really figure out what you want to get out of this experience.
So it's all about finding the right fit.
It is.
Okay, what are some things listeners should keep in mind as they're researching their options?
Well, I'd say start by thinking about your long-term goals.
What do I want to do with my life?
Exactly. What skills are you hoping to develop? Where do you see yourself working in the future? What kind of cultural experience are you looking for?
Okay, so the personal and professional goals.
Yeah. And of course, don't forget the practical considerations. Think about things like how much it will cost to live and study in a particular country,
Okay.
what the visa regulations are like,
Right?
and whether there are any opportunities to work after you graduate.
All the important stuff.
Yeah, and remember, there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
I like that.
Maybe a dual degree program or a joint program with universities in different countries, or even some online learning options could be a good fit for you.
So think outside the box.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of actually immersing yourself in a different culture.
It's more than just going to class.
Way more. It's about personal growth, expanding your horizons, and building a global network.
It's about challenging yourself and really embracing new experiences and new ways of looking at the world.
Exactly.
So for anyone out there who's thinking about taking the leap and studying abroad, I think the message is clear.
What's that?
Be bold, be curious, and don't be afraid to chart your own course.
I love that.
The future of international education is in your hands.
Well said.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and I hope you've all gained some valuable insights into the shifting landscape of international education. Remember, the world is full of opportunities. Go out there and make your mark.
I second that.
Thanks for joining us.